Hello. Thank you guys for joining me. This is Unexplained America, and I'm your host, Lisa. Hope you all are well. I've been busy with podcast work this week. I did take a week off last week, which was the first in a long time from putting out an episode. But I did have my event at the U.S. Marshals Museum. I have been finalizing the merch, which should be out on my website like this week. I'm very excited. I'll have a hat and a t-shirt for now. So, and also, let's see, I did an episode on Jack the Ripper for the Patreon. So if you wish for bonus content that is not on the channel, that is where to go. Go to my Patreon. It's very cheap. You get bonus content. You can support the podcast. I do a lot of interaction with the Patreon and connect with them, let them vote on such things, to do with even the podcast. So just lots of extra fun there if you want that. So this week's episode, it is on the Cleveland torso murder, also called the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run. And this case still remains unsolved, and it is from the 1930s. So I actually had no clue about this case. I was actually going to look at covering the torso killings in New York City in the 70s. I believe his name is it Richard Cottingham? Something like that. So I haven't dived into that, but I was going to cover that. And then when I went to, look at information, this popped up. So this 1930s Cleveland torso murders popped up. And I was surprised. I didn't know that this happened, didn't know anything about it. Really didn't know a lot about Cleveland. So this was really interesting to me. Sad, horrific. I had just gotten done with looking at Jack the Ripper and, of course, the Zodiac, which are both for the Patreon, but really kind of reminds me of Jack the Ripper-ish as far as just the cuttings, mutilation. So just trigger warning, there's, it does have a lot of those components in this case. So in 1935, the headless body of a man would be found in a poor, dank section of Cleveland called Kingsbury Run. This event would be the first of 12 bodies found in a 4-year span in Cleveland, Ohio. Police would never officially close this case, and worst of all, some victims still remain unnamed, and we'll kind of get into all that. So a little background on the city of Cleveland. Now, Cleveland was founded as a village, let's say, because of course, we've talked about this before. It was before it was incorporated and before, it was even possibly like a county and state situation going on in Ohio. So they founded this area and they named it Cleveland, and they founded it in 1796. And they named this area after a General Moses Cleveland. And he was Cleveland with like an A after the E at the beginning. So it was like Cleveland. I guess they shortened it or took out that A. But General Cleveland was one of 36 founding members of a group called the Connecticut Land Company. They found this land around it's the Cuyahoga. It's the Cuyahoga. Okay. So they founded this land around the Cuyahoga River. So, and later, this whole county that Cleveland is in is called the Cuyahoga County. So just know that. So this land was seen as the perfect capital of this settlement. And eventually Cleveland would become the capital of Ohio. So Cleveland wasn't just on the Cuyahoga River, but it's also right there on Lake Erie, which is part of the Great Lakes. So you kind of had the river, the lake. It was just a very great place to have a settlement, of course. You had a lot of movement, especially in the late 1700s where, they didn't necessarily have the train tracks yet, but they did have riverboats. So water was just a huge situation. So Cleveland was a very industrious town, and it grew and prospered. And by 1920, they had the Cleveland Indians, who are now the baseball team called the Guardians. They had won their first World Series. And by 1920, like, things were very huge. Like, really across America, things were really big, and just a lot of happening, a lot going on, a lot of innovation, wealth, like just a lot of huge items. In fact, the population by the time that Cleveland was, like, by 1930, it was right at about 900,000 people. So right under a million people in the city. And Cleveland was one of the largest cities in America, during this time. It was a very large city. But after the stock market crashed, of course, that happened in 1929, Cleveland began its descent into just high unemployment rates. The people that still had jobs, they faced wage cuts, and families were literally having to survive on garbage, or just, they were foraging for just a life. It was just very tough times for a lot of people, really across the nation, but it really hit cities. It really hit cities hard. So now this case centers around an area of Cleveland, because of course this is a big, big city, known as Kingsbury Run. And it was named after a James Kingsbury who had been like an original settler to the area. And Kingsbury was really a ravine, or like a natural watershed, which was on the south side of, like, the city of Cleveland. And it would empty into the Cuyahoga River, and it was near Lake Erie. So it was like on the river, near the lake, kind of, it was kind of separating. It was this natural just dip, okay? And at that time, the train tracks ran through this area, and the train would carry, all these transient people, people, they called them hobos at that time. They would just move along the different train routes. They were looking for anything, really. It was just tough times. They didn't have work. They were moving up and down, because another factor was Ohio was really a tough place to live in the winter. So there was just a lot of movement, a lot of transient people, a lot of just vagrants, what we would call vagrants, just awfulness. Now, in this area around this time frame, because of the situation with the, not having money, and you have a lot of people homeless, and you do have the transient people off the train. So you had, in this Kingsbury Run, you had these, what they called hobo jungles, or little makeshift camps. And people would just, basically they would just build these little shed homes, just some place to be and to, have a little bit of shelter in. And so, and this area in Kingsbury Run, this was a great area for this to happen, because they were coming off the trains. They were right there. Yeah. And the area was dark. You can imagine the 1930s. There wasn't just tons of street lights or whatever. It wasn't near as bad as what we think of as like the 1800s or anything, but it was dark. It was dreary. It was dangerous. It was unsanitary. You had a lot of people just kind of living in filth, and there was trash and filth and just people, and they didn't have any money or means. And again, they're just hopping trains. People are coming in and off the trains, and they're trying to avoid the harsh winter of Ohio. So right to the east of Kingsbury Run was an area known at the time called the Roaring Third. So on top of having this quote-unquote hobo jungle, or, basically what we would see is like a homeless camp, you also had this Roaring Third area, which was a very depressed area, and it was near the train tracks, and it was known for just seedy activity. So you had brothels, you had gambling, you had bars, just the things that come in when people are just depressed and down on their luck. So of course you have, too much of the drink and all of that. So all of that dark, depressing things were right in this area that we're going to be, in. So on Monday, September 23rd of 1935, two teenage boys discover a male body where the head was decapitated, and the man's genitals had been removed. The man was at the base of Kingsbury Run. The man's clothes were all missing except a pair of socks, so the body had socks. The body had been cleaned, drained of blood, and appearing so, with rope burns around the wrist. Now, the coroner, his name was A.J. Pierce, so he determined the cause of death was decapitation, hemorrhaging, and shock. And he thought that this person had been dead for about 3 days. Now, this body, it didn't have, obviously the head was decapitated, but at that time, the way to identify, people were fingerprints. They were doing a little bit of like the dental, that helped, like the dental work, the teeth. So with this body, fingerprints did identify the man as a Edward Anthony Andrassi, I believe. He was 29 years old. He was married with a child. He had been working as an orderly, actually in the psychiatric ward in the Cleveland City Hospital, but he had lost that job, and at that time, he had turned to petty theft. He wasn't working, so he turned to theft. He was known to frequent the Roaring Third area, right beside, of course, what we just talked about. So when the police were searching, they did find Edward's head. So they did end up finding his head. And they additionally, at the same time, found another body. Yes, so while working the crime scene for Edward, the police do come upon another body really very close by where Edward was found. This body was laying in weeds. This body was also decapitated and missing genitalia. This body was of a white male around 40 years old. Now, this was kind of weird, and we'll circle back to this, but this body's skin appeared to be covered in some sort of chemical burn or actual burn. The skin was red and leathery. The hair on the body was gone, so it had either been removed, shaved, whatever they thought, or burned off, which probably makes sense that it was burned off. Now, this was very similar to a body of a woman who had been found about a year before in the same area. She had the same chemical or real burn on her skin, and she was known as the Lady in the Lake, and we will get to her. So now this second body found would never be identified. Kind of, again, the only way to identify was like fingerprints and teeth. And so at this point, they couldn't get the fingerprints because of like the burn factor, from what I understood. So there was no way that they could get identification. And this body would be known as John Doe number 1. Now, a few months later, around January, so that had happened in September of 35. So on January 26th, in fact, 1936, the body parts of a woman are found neatly wrapped in newspaper, packed in 2 half-bushel baskets. So she was found around 20th Street, which would have been a few miles from the other victims. Now, 10 days later, around 5 miles from where she was found, the rest of her remains were found in a vacant lot. It said that her head was decapitated and never found, so they never found her head. Now, the killer, this time, the coroner noticed that the killer waited on rigor mortis to set in before dismembering her and before the decapitation happened, so that was a little bit different. Now, the Cleveland police used fingerprints to identify the body and found her to be a woman named Florence Polillo, and she will come up later. So she was 44 years old. She had been arrested before. She was on their books. She had worked as a waitress and barmaid, but she had also turned to sex work just to make ends meet. And she lived right at the end of the Roaring Third District. And so she kind of worked and lived in that area. Now, interesting enough, on this case, the coroner stated that they could not determine cause of death because the head is missing. So I thought that was interesting. So they wouldn't say it was like homicide. Yes. So at this point, the police literally have 3 victims. Like, I mean, this is within, goodness, like a few months, okay? 3 victims. Now, a little later in the year, so on June 5th, we're still 1936, so it was the early morning in Kingsbury Run, so 2 young boys discovered just the head of a white male. It's wrapped up in a pair of trousers. The following day, the police find the body of a 20-something-year-old man dumped in front of the Nickel Plate Railroad Police Station. Now, the head and the body were only 1,500 feet apart or so, like they were very close. The body was nude, clean, drained. The corpse was intact except for the head, okay? And then Coroner Pierce again determines the death by decapitation. Now, this man would be fingerprinted, and he also had very distinctive tattoos. Even so, the police would never find out the identity of this man. They did create a plaster reproduction of the man's head and a diagram and information, like very detailed information on his tattoos. The police would even display like this face and tattoos at the Great Lake Exposition they held in Cleveland in 1936. This was also known as the World Fair of 1936, by the way. So this was a huge event. This was something that they were trying to get kind of a lot of people, to look at this and see if they recognize this man, because they're thinking, surely someone is going to recognize this man. I mean, he had very distinct tattoos, and this would have been at a time where not many people had tattoos, okay? It wouldn't have been, nowadays that would be different, but then that 6 different tattoos would have been a lot, and they would have thought that they would have found someone who knew. Now, even though more than 100,000 people saw the death mask and the tattoo chart, again, the tattoo man wasn't claimed. No one knew. Now, some of these tattoos were names. So one said the name Helen, one tattoo said the name Paul, and one were initials. It was WCG. Now, these items are still to this day located in the Cleveland Police Museum. And FYI, this man would be labeled as John Doe number 2, and the police would also call him the Tattooed Man. Now, the police, during the investigation, would have a witness, they stated, that saw a Cadillac in the area kind of around the time that Tattooed Man was found. So So now, July 22nd, so otherwise, there's no one seeing any of this. These bodies are like dumped, found, 0 witnesses. I mean, this is what's going on. And there's not anybody around to be like, oh, well, I saw so-and-so. No. And again, this is a big city. This is, in a transient kind of homeless neighborhood where people are kind of in and out, and it's in the 30s, and nobody's really talking to the police. I mean, the police are trying to investigate this, but they're running into just, brick walls on this. So that was June 1936. So now July 22nd, 1936, a teenage girl comes across the headless, very decomposed remains of a 40-year-old white male. Now, she was walking through some woods near the west side of Cleveland. So this victim, it was said, was dead around 2 months, the coroner thought. The police would find the head of the body, but it was pretty much skeleton when they found it. There were clothes found nearby that were bloody, and there was an enormous amount of blood found that had seeped into the ground around the body. Now, this body, this was kind of a little different. Now, this body was the first to be a little outside of the Kingsbury Run, so this said west. So the Kingsbury Run is more to the east of the city. And also, kind of an element of finding blood was very new, because the other bodies, it had almost been like they had, they were either drained of blood. There wasn't blood around the other bodies. They had been, it's like they were killed somewhere and then dumped or whatever. Now, this showed that the killer actually left the body in the actual location where the death had occurred, like where he had killed it. Now, the skull had long hair and the clothes were very tattered, and this led the police to believe the man was from one of the homeless camps. The fingers were too decomposed as well as the head, so the police did look through missing persons reports, but that didn't help, and this man would also go unidentified and become John Doe number 3. So now you have 3 unidentified men. Now in September, so we're literally like 6 weeks later, not even. So a homeless man, he trips over the upper half of a white male torso. So that's all it is. I mean, he comes upon this. Can you even imagine? The police came to search the area, which was said to be kind of like an open sewer or creek area in the Kingsbury Run near 37th Street. And they had a fire crew actually dredge this creek area, and they did find the lower half of the torso and parts of the man's legs. So they never found the man's head. Yeah. So the coroner did find that the kidney and stomach were removed from the torso, as were the genitals. And yet again, the death was, decapitation. Now, the coroner noted 0 hesitation marks. So he noted that this killer was very strong, very confident, very familiar with human anatomy. Okay. Now, the police found near the creek a dirty felt hat with blood spots, and the hat was labeled Loudy's Smart Shop, which this was a shop in Bellevue, Ohio, which is about 70 miles away. Now, the police also found a blue work shirt covered in blood and wrapped in newspaper near the creek. And this man was determined to be around 20 years old or so, and he was labeled as John Doe number 4. Now, this time, an estimated 600 people or so came up and crowded around this situation. This was really becoming a problem in the city. I mean, this is several deaths, heinous deaths. We're talking body parts being found. Someone's going around not only killing people, but dismembering them, leaving their body parts around. I mean, this would have felt very, very scary, violent, I'm sure vicious. And then just the fact that the coroner's saying, okay, this person is strong, they're confident, they're not hesitating with their cut marks. It's just, yeah. So a frenzy is beginning to happen. It was almost like, okay, the first 2 deaths, the media was probably like, they were talking, but not huge. These men would have been, transients or whatever. But now this was a frenzy. This was many brutal. I mean, you had 6 brutal killings. So, and the media was more than chattering. I mean, the headlines and the police have no clues. They have no suspects going on. So all the major press in Cleveland, like the Cleveland Press, the Cleveland News, and the Cleveland Plain Dealer, they reported daily on the killings by now. So this is September 1936, and now we've got, it's a frenzy. They're reporting daily on the killings. They're reporting daily on the lack of suspects. Tension is mounting. It's just, yeah, I can imagine. Like, this was a very scary situation going on in Cleveland. And the newspapers actually labeled the killer as the Kingsbury Slayer. One article stated a psychiatrist and the police, they see the decapitations as a drug to the pervert's brain, meaning this guy is a pervert, and the only thing that seems to make this guy happy is the fact that he is decapitating people. I mean, how heinous. That is just, I can't even imagine if even that was going on, like, I live in a small town, but like Little Rock, Arkansas, or even if that was happening in, St. Louis, Missouri these days. I mean, that would be horrendous. Now, these days, with all of our advancement, of course, leaving this much evidence, in the 1930s, they could leave, bloody this and bloody that because you didn't have, the technology, you didn't have the DNA testing and such. So it just wasn't, it just wasn't the same. It's just very scary. So due to the mounting pressure of the cases, the Cleveland mayor at that time, his name was Harold Burton, so he gets a newly appointed safety director, one Eliot Ness. Now, you've probably all heard of Mr. Ness. So, Mayor Burton wants Eliot Ness to get more involved in the cases. So, little side note, by this time, so this is 1936, Eliot was a well-known lawman. Okay, he was already well-known. He was already well-known. He was, I guess, probably even coming off of his heyday. So he was known for his work in Chicago and how he had formed the Untouchables and how he took down Al Capone. And, he was huge in the Prohibition years. And so Prohibition was actually over in 1933. So by 1935, Ness had actually moved to Cleveland and was appointed director of the safety board, which would have been like a political position over all of the police activity, okay? So he would have been not necessarily the police commissioner, but he would have been above that. So, and he had, I guess, he had come from Chicago and after Prohibition, and of course, during Prohibition, he had fought that, but even afterwards, he had still spent time in Illinois, helping out with, so alcohol was legal, but he was kind of like a alcohol and beverage commissioner and making sure that people were actually paying taxes on it and not bootlegging the product now. So anyway, but now Ness is in Cleveland. So Ness is wanting for the detectives to shake down all the homeless camps. So he feels like the perpetrator is in the homeless camps among the transients. So he really wants the camps cleared out. He is on board with that activity. Okay, so that's what he's wanting, and we'll talk about that. So the police and the coroner and Ness and all these experts and such, they do get together. They kind of have a meeting. They're reviewing the cases. They're trying to get a so-called, probably this is before they did FBI profiling, of course, but they're trying to get an understanding of the type of person that is doing this. What is this person like? Is this person, maybe someone in the medical field? Do they have a lot of medical knowledge? Do they not? This is what they're trying to figure out. Who is the type of person that is responsible for the killings? So the police department, they do put 2 full-time detectives on the cases. They do, one is a Peter Murillo and then a Martin Zaleski, I think. They begin infiltrating the Kingsbury Run area and the Roaring Third area. So when they're not working on the clock, they are going undercover and dressing the part of the people that would hang out in those areas. So they're just infiltrating these areas. They're trying to figure out, again, who this is. Now, during their work on the cases, they would literally interview around 1,500 people. Now, the department as a whole interviewed 5,000 or so people. They're trying to get a handle on this. This is big news. It's becoming national news. It's a huge problem. They want this fixed. This is the biggest investigation of the Cleveland Police Department's history, by the way. So, in 1936, by November, they have elections. So, Coroner A.J. Pierce is replaced by a new coroner. I think the mayor had remained the same, but the coroner is different. So this man is a younger man. His name is Samuel Gerber. And Gerber has a fierce dedication to medicine, but he also has a law degree. So he's kind of, he's very, he's a little younger. He is very educated, and he becomes part of the investigation efforts. It's kind of all hands on deck. Everybody's trying to figure this out, okay? Now, in February, this is February 23rd, 1937, a man finds the upper half of a woman's torso. It had washed up in this is the Brontenau, Cleveland area. So it's a little town a little northeast of Kingsbury, like not very far. Now, 3 months later, the rest of her torso, I mean, we're talking 3 months, washes up in the Kingsbury area, and her head is never discovered. There was a lot of water and gravel actually found in her lungs. So she is thought to be in her 20s, and she is never identified. And she actually becomes Jane Doe number 1. And this is 37. So in June, couple months later, June 6th, 1937, so a teenage boy, he finds a human skull under what's called the Lorraine Carnegie Bridge, which crossed the Cuyahoga River there. And that bridge, I will say, just a little tidbit, it had only been there for 5 years at that time. And it's a very it's architecturally interesting bridge. Like it's kind of Art Deco. Anyway, the bridge, the bridge is only 5 years old. So next to the skull was a burlap bag containing the skeletal remains of a small African-American woman. There was a newspaper enclosed dated exactly a year before. So it's like dated June of 1937. Now, dental work unofficially identifies this woman as a Rose Wallace, who was said to work and live in the same area, actually, as that Florence Piccolo. Now, Rose was around 40 years old, and she hadn't actually been seen since August of 1936. So that makes her remains, per the newspaper or per the sighting, around a year old. So officially, the victim was known as Jane Doe 2. Now, Rose's son, he felt, and he told the detectives, he very much felt like this was his mother. Now, at that time, the only reason the police thought otherwise was the newspaper being dated June and then Rose being officially gone since August. So that was the only thing that made them think that maybe it wasn't Rose, okay? So who knows? Again, they tentatively could look at like dental records, okay? So they do label her as Jane Doe number 2. Now, July 6th of 1937, a young guardsman with the National Guard, he had been kind of called in to deal with some labor issues they were having that summer, so they have the guardsman come in. So he sees a body part floating in the Cuyahoga River in the wake of a tugboat. So behind a tugboat, he kind of sees this body part. Over the next few days, police would recover the entire body except for the head, and the abdomen would prove to be gutted and the heart was missing from the torso. So the man was a 30-year-old-ish white male, and he would never be identified. But he was known as John Doe 5. So at this point, there's not an exact kind of person that this is happening to, but you do have 5 male, and you do have only like a couple of women. So this kind of victim profiling is kind of tough because it's not an exact, and you do have different ages, but you do have quite a bit of males. So it almost really seems just like a crime of convenience, really, or who is convenient for me to nab or take, I guess. I don't know. It's very, very strange. So now, so that was July of 37. So almost a year later, so they kind of go a year without any incident, anything going on. So on April 8th, 1938, a young man on his way to work, he sees what he thought was a dead fish along the banks of the Cuyahoga. Okay, so he's kind of looking. He's in the same area, same river. He thinks he just sees a dead fish. As he approaches it, it turns out to be the lower half of a woman's leg. Now, the following month, the police pulled 2 burlap bags out of the river, which contained parts of the rest of this woman, part of her torso and the rest of her legs, Her head and arms are never found. Now, this would be the first victim to be found with morphine in her system. So they had been checking for any drugs in the systems, and this woman had morphine, and she was never identified. She would become known as Jane Doe number 3. So that's very interesting. So now you have morphine. You still have a very similar MO to the rest of the bodies, but now you have the evidence of the morphine. It's just interesting. So August, so literally a few months later, 3 scrap collectors foraging in a dump. This was located across from East 9th Street. So they find the torso of a woman. It's wrapped up in a man's double-breasted blazer, which was then had been wrapped up in an old quilt. So this was literally like a torso wrapped in a blazer, wrapped in a quilt. Yes. The legs and arms were found, like close by in a recently constructed makeshift box, and they were wrapped in brown butcher paper and held together with rubber bands. This is very specific. So this is it's interesting that they were wrapped, like some of the items are wrapped and some of them aren't. It's just very interesting. So the head was actually found wrapped very similarly to the legs and arms, okay? Now, Dr. Gerber, he notes that some of the body parts look to be refrigerated. So to me, this is very much saying that, this person has to have the space. Some of these bodies, this person really took a lot of time with. Like a lot of time, a lot of space. Just think about being able to refrigerate something. So that to me is pretty telling about this killer. And if it is the same killer, and it definitely appears the police are thinking it's the same killer. So, and it's awful if you think that there are multiple of these people running around. That's even worse. I don't know what's worse. It's like a serial killer's worse, or it's just scary across the board. So when the police are looking for parts of the woman in this dump, so they find another body. Literally only yards away from the body in the same dump. Now, this man, it's a male body that they find. He's been decapitated. Both of these bodies were literally in plain view of Eliot Ness's office window. So like his office window looked down on this dump, okay? Both bodies would not be identified, so the woman became known as Jane Doe 4, and now the man is John Doe 6. We're heavy in these John Does, okay? These victims were the 11th and 12th victims. Now, if you look at actual newspaper clippings, they would call these people the 12th and 13th because they're thinking about the lady in the water, which we'll get to. But anyway, so it is unclear. Some are 11, some are 12, but some sources say 12 victims, some sources say 13. So it really depends on who they thought was a true blue victim of these same murders, okay? So, having had enough, this is the 11th and 12th victims. This was literally staring at his office, okay? So, this happened on August 16th of 1938. So, Eliot Ness has had enough. On August 18th, right before 1 a.m., Eliot shows up with a group of about 35 police officers and detectives. They have 11 squad cars, 2 police vans, 3 fire trucks, and they raid the homeless encampment in Kingsbury Run. They go in there. And this has been building. Ness has wanted this for a couple years. And finally, I guess he got the green light after so many deaths. Like after the 12th victim, they're like, go for it. They gather up around 65 men. By dawn and the light, so like once it's, light enough for them to look around, they're searching the deserted shacks for clues. They're looking for any type of clues to see, who this killer could be. Is this killer in this camp? That's what they're looking for. Now, Ness orders, after they've searched, he orders for the shacks to be set on fire, and they allow the shacks to burn to the ground. Now, Ness, in the wake of this, he faces severe criticism for these actions, okay? The public was not thrilled, obviously, about the murders going on, but they're also not thrilled about the treatment of the homeless. The critics state the raids would do absolutely nothing to solve the crimes, and they would be correct, sadly correct. So now you have a situation where you already have 12, victims of a horrendous, awful, awful murder, and now you have a whole homeless community. This is all these people had burned to the ground and all these people displaced. So remember, we had mentioned, we touched on the lady in the lake victim. Now, she was from 1934. So here are like two, including the lady in the lake. So two possible other victims of the torso killer. So, because they really felt like, again, these could be possible victims. The MO, is similar. So the lady in the lake. So the lower half of a woman's torsos, and this is like 1934. So the lower half of a woman's torso, her thighs are still attached, but amputated at the knees. So this washes up on the shore of Lake Erie, just east of that Bracknell, Ohio, that little community that was very close to this whole Kingsbury Run. We're talking miles apart. This happens on September 5th of 1934. A search yields only a few other body parts. The head is never found. She is nicknamed the Lady of the Lake. She did have an abdominal scar, but they felt, the coroner at that time would have been Pierce, they felt like it was from a hysterectomy, which was pretty common, but it did they said it made it more difficult to identify her. Now, after she was found, several people reported seeing body parts in the water, including a group of fishermen who believed to have seen a head. The Lady of the Lake was found virtually in the same spot as that Jane Doe number 1. And it said that both victims had like the chemical, which the other person with the chemical situation was the John Doe, but it was believed that they had the same type of chemical burn. Remember, there was a burn, and it looked like, so the Lady of the Lake, it looked like she had been burned with lime chloride, and they felt like supposedly the killer meant to use this as a way to like kind of hurry up the decomposition, but mistakenly the lime actually preserved the bodies instead, because it kind of went more leathery instead of like breaking down the skin, if that makes sense. So that's the Lady in the Lake. Now, there is another possible victim they felt. Now, this one happened in 1950. So this is on July 22nd of 1950, a Robert Robertson, who is around 41 years old, he is discovered at a 2138 Davenport Avenue in Cleveland. Now, the police believed he had been dead for about 6 to 8 weeks, and he appeared to have been intentionally decapitated, kind of fitting the profile of these other victims. Now, Robertson was estranged from his family. He had an arrest record. He was known as an alcoholic and kind of on the fringe of society, I guess, hanging out in that, Roaring Third situation. Now, despite widespread newspaper coverage kind of linking his death to the torso murder, the detectives did treat and feel like his death was a totally isolated situation. So more than not, a lot of people felt like Robert was not part of those killings. And I would say, I don't know. We'll look at the suspects and I don't know. Let me know what you think. If you think Robert is part of it. I definitely feel like the Lady of the Lake was with the chemical burns. The torso found. definitely the same MO. It was just maybe she was the first one. And that's to think if there, I mean, there could be several other bodies that just weren't found. Now, I will say the fact that so many were found, that this killer wanted it that way. I mean, obviously, but you never know. The killer could have killed a lot more people and just not had put the bodies out in plain sight, or had even, all of them tended to go in the river or the lake. So maybe the killer actually put them in the lake and they weren't found. And you do have a situation in Ohio where the river, it's freezing. It's very cold there. So there's just a lot of factors going on. So there definitely could have been more victims, quote unquote. So those were the victims. Let's get into the possible suspects. So on Wednesday, July 5th of 1939, the police arrest a man named Frank Dolezal. I think it's Dolezal or Dolezal. They had been following him around for weeks. They had been after him. He kind of popped up and they had been following him. So they bring him in. After questioning him for about 24 hours, he does admit to first knowing Florence Piccolo. He says he knows Florence. And then he also mentioned that he knows Rose. Okay, so this is after he had been sequestered with them for about a day. Now, after a few more days, he does confess to killing Florence, but the story that he initially gives is basically trying to look like it was, self-defense or whatever. He states that Florence took $10 from him and that he wanted it back. And long story short, she comes to his place and she lunges at him with a butcher knife, and then he gets it away from her. And then he alleges that he pushes her into a bathtub, pushes her against the bathtub, and that this kills her. Okay. Then he decides to dismember her to kind of hide all this. So this is his confession. Now, his confession on all of the things, because he confesses, to this, but his confession is crazy. It's bewildering, at times completely incoherent, but then sometimes he would come back and be super precise about details of what he had done. Now, they're going, they've got him arrested. He's being held for trial or whatever. Now, before he can actually go on trial for Florence's death, he is found dead in his jail cell. He had allegedly hung himself. Now, very few people in retrospect, very few people involved and very few people afterwards, believe he was actually the torso killer. A lot of people came forward and he was weird, but he wasn't a killer. There was just a lot of kind of not feeling like he was the guy. He definitely knew Florence, and I guess he could have had some involvement with her death, but he was just very kind of in and out, unsure of a lot of stuff. A lot of the details that he did give, the police felt like were coached, or maybe even things that he had read in the paper. So they felt like it was one of those. And there were definitely people that came forward and said that he was extremely strange, but definitely not harmful. So a lot of people didn't really buy this one, okay? They just didn't. Now, another suspect investigated by Eliot Ness himself was a Dr. Francis Sweeney. So Sweeney, who had been born in 1894, he actually dies in 1964. So he was a veteran of World War I, and he had been part of a medical unit that did conduct amputations in the field. So he would have had that kind of knowledge, that kind of experience with that. Now, after the war, it said that Sweeney, he came back, that he became an alcoholic due to just the anxiety, depression that came from his wartime experiences. Now, his heavy drinking did begin in 1929, And by 1934, his alcoholism led to a separation from his wife. So it kind of broke apart his family. Now, Sweeney is actually personally interviewed by Eliot Ness himself. And they get him, and this is kind of delicate because Sweeney had connections, and we'll get into that. But before they go to interrogate Sweeney, so Sweeney is so intoxicated that he cannot, he's incoherent, he's not helpful. So they hold him, like none of this is official, so to speak. They literally hold him in a hotel room for 3 days, it said, until they can get him sobered up enough to then go into questioning. So under questioning, it is said that he fails 2 very early primitive polygraph machine tests. Again, if you guys, a lot of people fail or pass polygraph machine tests now, but these are very primitive ones, and evidently he failed these tests. Now, both tests were administered by an expert named Leonard Keeler. Now, he told Ness, I guess Keeler told Ness that Sweeney was the culprit. Like, he felt like Sweeney was the person. Now, Eliot Ness apparently felt there was very little chance of obtaining like a successful prosecution. They just did not have the, evidence of conviction or whatever. So especially in Sweeney, like I said, was very connected. Like he was very connected in the community. He had a first cousin who was a congressman named Martin Sweeney. So, which was actually one of, Eliot Ness's political opponents, not really happy about Ness, and he was always hounding Ness publicly about his failure to catch the killer. So Ness felt like this would be very, very difficult to prosecute Sweeney to prove that he was actually the torso killer. But Ness believed in his heart that Sweeney was the person. Now, after this situation with Ness, Sweeney actually commits himself to an institution. And after this happens, there are 0 leads or connections that police could, say. Like nothing else happens after he is committed. Now, from his confinement, Sweeney does send threatening postcards and harasses Ness and his family well into the 1950s, okay? So he is sending correspondence to Ness and typically postcards. Now, the postcards only stopped arriving after he dies. And Sweeney does end up dying in a veterans hospital in Dayton, Ohio in 1964. Yes. So that is interesting. Now, while Sweeney was considered a viable suspect, the evidence against him was circumstantial. Ness did not feel like he could get any type of indictment. In 1929, Sweeney was a surgical resident at the St. Alexis Hospital in Kingsbury Run. He also had an office on the same street where a man named Emil Fronick claimed a doctor had tried to drug him in 1934. And remember, one of the victims had morphine in their systems. Now, Emil's story was ultimately discounted as he could not relocate the building with the police the following day. Like he couldn't actually go back to where this allegedly happened. So he didn't seem like that great of a witness. Upon finding a victim with drugs in her system and looking through buildings, it was found that Sweeney did have an office next to a coroner in the area where Emil had suggested he had been drugged. Now, Sweeney would practice in this coroner's morgue, and he would have obviously a place, a clean, convenient location to actually kill the victim. So this was just more, I guess, leverage for Ness. But again, he didn't really, feel like he had enough. Now, in addition to the Dolezal and Sweeney, authorities also consider a different suspect, a man named Willie Johnson. Now, Willie was an African-American male who had committed a similar murder in June of 1942. So I guess he's found to commit a murder in 42. Now, Johnson had been spotted by a young girl while disposing of a trunk, which was later found to contain the torso of a 19-year-old woman named Margaret Frances Wilson. Wilson's head and arms were found in nearby bushes, while her legs would be found at Johnson's home 2 weeks later. Wow. So a Charles Sadati, who operated a bootleg joint, identified Johnson in a lineup as being a partner to one Rose Wallace. So that was another connection. Now, Rose, had allegedly entered the store, this man's store, in August of 36 and had been physically assaulted, or I guess Johnson had physically assaulted Wallace that night. Now, links to Florence Polillo have been speculated, and an informant claimed Polillo argued with an African-American man nicknamed One-Armed Willie the day before her murder. And a man of the same nickname was alleged to have been in a relationship with Wallace, which we mentioned. Although coroner Samuel Gerber touted Johnson as a suspect, he was never conclusively linked. So he was just kind of discussed, but kind of like Sweeney. Yeah. So Johnson was tried and convicted of Wilson's murder, and after a lengthy psychological evaluation, was executed by electric chair in 1944. So basically, he committed that crime in 42, and it looked very much similar to some of these other murders, but nothing was conclusive there, sadly. Now, in August of 1937, Detective Murillo did have a person that they felt like was a really good suspect. There had been a lot of tips about this man. They did identify him as living on West 23rd Street, and evidently this man was described to be an alcoholic. He was a sadist, but he could never, evidently this is a bad man, and a lot of people turned him in for this, but Murillo could never have information or anything to support a connection to the murder. So this man was literally unnamed, okay? They didn't even give him a name. He was never named. Now, in 1997, so this is, 40 years later, pretty much. So other theories, people have had is that there wasn't any one single torso murder. Like there wasn't one person, that it was, these people were being killed by completely different people. Now, this was based on the assumption that the autopsy results were inconclusive, because sometimes they were. Now, the detective Murillo believed that the torso murderer could have been a transient who was just riding along the rails, as most of the murders occurred near the railroad tracks, and then believed that they were, murders in other states that were similar to these killings in Cleveland. Now, Murillo went undercover several times, as a hobo to investigate this idea, but this idea never panned out. They never found anybody. And yeah, so again, is it scarier to think that this was multiple people though, or one person? That's a good question. Let me know what you guys think. I feel like this was one person. I don't feel like it was several people. Now, there was a slight connection, and there's never been definitive information. Obviously, the Black Dahlia case went unsolved, but it was said that Sweeney was sending the correspondence to Ness, and evidently he had sent postcards and such that kind of tried to state that there was a similarity between the torso murders and then the Black Dahlia case. So that was regarding the Sweeney correspondence with Ness, and that never went anything. A lot of people feel like that was not a thing, but that was mentioned, that could, was in a similar time frame, and it was brutal. The bodies were cleaned, drained of blood, that kind of thing. That was the connection. So now in August of 2024, the Cleveland torso killings are back in the news, okay? In a good way. So, well, as good as possible way, I guess. Now, a nonprofit organization called the DNA Doe Project, they help basically with law enforcement on the cost of all this DNA testing. So they're just trying to help law enforcement figure out these unknown victims. Now, they are working with the Cuyahoga County Medical's examiner's office, and, they've got 10 victims that are unnamed in the torso killings. Now, they have already exhumed 2 victims, at least from what I found. 2 victims have been exhumed. One was the tattoo man, or John Doe number 2, and then the other victim was the John Doe number 6, found in the summer of 1938. So what they'll do is they get they extract their DNA, they get a DNA profile, and then they build a family tree around this profile, and they find common ancestors. So, of course, the common, goal is to find out, who these people are related to, and if these people have someone in their family that is, not identified. So they're just trying to find their family members. And how amazing would that be? I mean, literally, so these 10 unknown victims, they had to be buried in just these unmarked, graves, just as in this Potter's Field situation. So it's just a very, very sad thing to not have their identity. And so this is an awesome thing that the DNA Doe Project is doing. And hopefully, now this was in August 24th, so hopefully they're still working on it. Hopefully they will find out who these people are. Now, in April of this year, there was a press release about how an independent film company named Shoestring Productions, they had gotten permission to do some filming in one of Cleveland's government buildings. And they actually are filming, it said, this month. Now, this film is, I don't know what kind of film. I don't know if it's a documentary film. It just says film. It is supposed to be released to the Cleveland International Film Festival by next spring. So that is the goal. And basically they're trying to bring awareness, to the victims, to the killings, and especially to the fact that there are unnamed victims and unidentified victims. So again, hopefully with the DNA progress, some of these victims will, be figured out. They'll find out who they belong to. And just this case is just so sad in so many ways, but there is hope, and hopefully, and obviously people still care about these victims. They care to see them get claimed by their families, distant relatives or whatever. So, but thank you guys for listening. This is all I have on the torso murders and the madman of Kingsbury Run. There was a lot of names, granted, the Slayer, but definitely hug your family and have a great week. And I will be getting with you soon with more episodes. Love ya. Bye.